Friday, the premiers and the Prime Minister wound up the most harmonious First Ministers' Conference in recent memory. Standing out in the sea of Tory First Ministers was Manitoba's new Democratic Party Premier Howard Pawley. Mr. Pawley has philosophical differences with the other Conservative leaders. But at a time when the desire for a new era of federal-provincial relations seems so strong, Manitoba had no desire to be odd man out.
The government of Manitoba agreed to have journal cameras behind the scenes to witness the preparations and the hotel room caucuses that were held last week in Regina to plot strategy. Tonight, a special documentary on the efforts of Manitoba officials to make sure that their premier, Howard Pawley, was odd man in. The Journal's Bruce Yucato reports.
Premier Pawley of Manitoba.
Brian Mulroney has lots of friends and allies around the conference table, but for Manitoba's Howard Pawley, there are none. At home, he trails in the polls and must call an election within 18 months. This conference on the economy presents a minefield of possibilities for him. He and his small delegation have perhaps the finest line to tread here. Behind the scenes, his officials have held endless meetings, his ministers countless consultations, all trying to predict and plan the conference's final outcome, inventing maneuvers to avoid their premier being left as the odd man out. This conference has long been billed as the start of a new era in federal-provincial relations. Premier Pawley's political task here is to be seen to get along with the Conservative government he has already quarreled with and will, no doubt, again. For weeks, his advisors have been looking for ways to find allies amongst all the Conservative First Ministers around the table. Michael Decter still looks like a college student. But despite the boyish appearance, he is the Premier's right-hand man. As clerk of the Executive Council, he is the province's most powerful civil servant. He dominates the behind-the-scenes preparations for the conference, negotiating agenda details with Ottawa, advising the Premier, and directing the bureaucratic and political groundwork of the key provincial departments. The fine-tuning of Manitoba's strategy for the conference begins at this closed-door meeting, 10 days before the premiers themselves assemble.
He's a little concerned at the notion of being characterized by the entire national press as the odd man out. So his dual direction was, one, find common ground where it exists with other provinces and the feds. Two, let's put forward some innovative thinking that isn't in conflict.
So as they begin to put together the background briefing books and prepare the position papers, the clear signal from the Premier's office goes out. This is no time for strident sermons on socialist theology. At 7:30 every morning, Howard Pawley climbs into his K-car for the 45-minute drive to the legislature. In Manitoba, speculation about the timing of an election has already begun. As the countdown in the press starts, Pawley is trying to push an image of the NDP as good economic managers.
First, it's the most important message. I think it's important from our point of view, I make no apologies for this, that we focus on job creation, economic development.
It is perhaps making a virtue of necessity. Other issues like French language rights have been nothing but trouble for Pawley, and an imminent Supreme Court decision will revive that soon, as early as next month. The NDP has had trouble with the abortion issue as well. Demonstrations pro and con reflect a division that extends into the party itself. Pawley would much rather talk about his power deal. A $3.2 billion sale to the Americans will bring new hydro construction to the Nelson River in northern Manitoba.
You can apply to the Manitoba Jobs and Training Program.
They are even taking to the airwaves with a slick ad campaign promoting their job creation schemes. It is generally believed the electoral fate of the NDP government depends on their ability to keep the political debate centered on economic matters.
No question about it. We were way down during the French language debate. It was an issue that detracted from our overall central message, and their momentum is now with us. Decimal polling and other polling results have indicated that there's been improvement in our standing.
The perception is that Manitobans don't want to see anything interfere with their reasonably successful economic recovery. The outlook for 1985 isn't quite so rosy, but last year, the province registered growth above and unemployment well below the national average. all of which makes the First Ministers' Conference crucial to Howard Pawley's political fortunes. Any signs that Pawley is frozen out by his provincial colleagues or unable to work with the new federal government on the economy would likely be politically lethal. February 7th, it's a full week before the conference, but there is already a draft communique for Pawley to discuss confidentially at the cabinet table.
Go into the meeting, Premier, and I think the ministers are there.
So much of any First Minister's meeting does seem preordained, with little left to chance. But despite all the pre-planning like this, issues barely mentioned ahead of time prove to be Pawley's salvation, and overtures that seem so bright with the promise of common ground are nowhere by conference time. Here it's reported there are signals Ottawa will play ball on tax reform.
I think there is a feeling on the part of the Prime Minister's office that they want to live up to their campaign commitments on tax reform, and they're looking for some way of doing it. And I think, you know, you've mentioned previously calling for a national conference of business, labor, and governments. I think that might well be welcomed as a way around the government-to-government problems.
Does anybody have any problems with the call for a national conference on tax reform? This is being done in Australia. I would urge that we convene a national tax conference.
The notion is duly inserted in the Premier's opening statement, almost word for word how it was brought up in the private meeting in Winnipeg. But if Prime Minister Mulroney or Finance Minister Michael Wilson were ever interested in tax reform, they give no sign of it at the conference table. While some do pick up on the theme of fairness, tax reform in general goes over like the proverbial lead balloon. This bid to bring the odd man in fails in the end. The private meeting of officials in a legislative office in Manitoba 10 days before the conference. They decide to cast another line in Ottawa's direction.
Ontario's going to play that role.
There's still discussion going on amongst the ministers responsible for the status of women on how to celebrate the end of the decade for women.
One thought I had, I take it we are hosting the ministers responsible for the status of women in Winnipeg in June.
Right.
Wondered if our Premier might not extend an invitation to the Prime Minister to attend.
I think our way of demonstrating that commitment would be our active support this summer to the conference of ministers pertaining to the status of women.
As one, Mr. Premier, who has a record number of women in the federal cabinet, be honored to accept the invitation.
Very good.
In fact, at one point, the decision to invite Mulroney publicly had been reversed, but not till Mulroney had been told by his officials to be prepared to accept. One of the few cordial moments between Pawley and Mulroney almost doesn't come off.
Well, actually, as you may recall, it was in an earlier draft of the Premier's statement, but the invitation wasn't really in the final version as delivered by the Premier. However, apparently the Prime Minister had been briefed that the invitation might be extended, and on that basis he accepted it. So I guess we will look forward to having the Prime Minister visit Winnipeg in June.
On the eve of the conference, the Manitoba group pulls up to their Regina hotel.
Thank you.
Pawley's first order of business is a private dinner with the other First Ministers. It is their first chance to meet face-to-face. The informal talks will drag on till almost 11 o'clock. When it's done, Pawley and his officials have their last private strategy session at the hotel before showtime. After listening to a long debate between Brian Mulroney and René Lévesque about interest rates, Pawley decides to sharpen up that part of his opening statement.
The dollar is going to go down, down, and down, and we're going to end up with 50, 60 cents unless we follow Bowie and his policies.
Don't get trapped into a number. And what the premiers have always said is the federal government's too fixated with the dollar in the short term. If you do what's right for the economy in a long-term sense, eventually the dollar problem will look after itself.
Pawley also says to expect some action on job training before the first session ends. The truth is, the first day session will be remembered for little else.
They anticipate they'll be at the upgrading the skills of our citizens at about possibly 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
There seems to be no inkling at all that Mulroney and Flora MacDonald will virtually preempt the conference by announcing a $1 billion job training plan.
I sense this is the area where there's a best possibility of consensus.
Nor do they seem aware of Peter Lougheed's plan to lead a strong provincial attack on federal interest rate policy.
Where do we really have to
See, I don't think we're facing the energy issue head-on. We may not be facing the interest rate issue head-on at this conference. All of us at this conference have witnessed the devastating effects of high interest rates, and I want to deal for a few moments with the comments by Premier Lougheed.
Ironically, it is just that unexpected attack on interest rates that lets Pauley claim his common ground with the other provinces. Upstairs, away from the cameras and media, Dector and press aide Cliff Scotton watch on TV. They are once again turning their minds to the problems of negotiating the usual final communique, the formal conclusions all 11 First Ministers agree to. That, too, has been talked about behind the scenes for weeks. Long before a word was uttered in Regina, telexes had been fired off, haggling over details about just what those formal conclusions should say. At this closed-door meeting in the Cabinet Room in Winnipeg a week earlier, there were already lots of problems with the communique proposed by Ottawa.
Well, we certainly didn't sing from that hymn book in the province.
The communique is still up in the air when the first day of the conference is over. Pauley grabs some airtime and plays up his agreements with Lougheed and others on interest rates.
Depending a lot on the banks for their financing, so that the unemployment.
Meanwhile, Dector and his federal-provincial relations expert, Jim Eldridge, head off to another hotel for one more secret late-night meeting. Officials from all 11 governments make their last attempt to hammer out a communique. Back with the Premier at breakfast the next morning, they report that even now it's not clear everyone wants a communique.
There was an initial discussion last night among officials, and frankly, several of them indicated that they didn't think their respective First Ministers wanted a communique at all, including the federal people. Then we decided that since this was the communique drafting committee, it wasn't really up to us to decide whether there would be one or not. We thought we'd better get one put together in case the decision was to go with it. But there's quite a bit of ambivalence. The Prime Minister's not sure he wants one.
In the middle of all this, copies of the communique that may never see the light of day are delivered to the suite. There are worries about what it does and does not say.
But there's no reference to tax reform?
No, the taxation section reads the following. First Ministers agreed to examine incentive measures to ensure that they are more effective in encouraging investment and allocating the economy's resources more efficiently.
They are shying away. I did talk about this at noon. I said, look, we would have to have this as part of the total package, but there was no response. Everybody was very polite and didn't respond.
With the communique on shaky ground, they make plans to prevent the feds from getting the last word.
It's an overall kind of strategy issue. If we emphasize all the points that we want that are different and stand up too strongly for them, we may run the risk of no communique, in which case the reporting will only be very much through the Prime Minister. So we have to weigh.
Yes, though I would sooner have that than a communique that we have grave difficulty living with. And then we can just issue our own statement.
For the rest of the morning, aides are busy beefing up the Premier's closing statement. If there is to be no communique, it is their chance to put their own interpretation on just what the conference means and what their role was. The morning session runs late. The First Minister's last working lunch starts behind schedule. It is to be their last attempt at a communique. But even as they arrive, it is obvious the attempt is a cursory and half-hearted one. The Prime Minister is back at the table calling the closing session to order after just an hour and a half, right on time. Not until the First Ministers assembled again on stage for their closing statements was it apparent that the suspicions of the morning breakfast meeting were confirmed. After all the meetings and nitpicking about language and wording and tone, there would be no communique.
As we've done in a fairly...
For Brian Mulroney, the conference could not have gone better. The appearance of goodwill with nothing on paper to tie him down. Pauley emerges without getting burnt, even with a chance to deal himself in on the phantom consensus.
Some of our friends in the media have been referring to this conference as a meeting, as a love-in. And I have no real problem with that.
So everyone can go home happy enough, The dreaded odd man out scenario has been averted. It is jokingly called a triumph of fuzzy federalism. The disappointment at the lack of a communique disappears in the time it takes to loosen a tie.
Candidly, I was not displeased that there was no communique. I think I would have been placed in a position of having to exempt myself from some of the language that might have been used. When we were dealing with the tax question, I think I would have felt obliged to indicate that we want a tax reform, fairness. That point about a tax conference wasn't really picked up, to my disappointment. I think the message out of this conference has been clearly made without the need for a communique. And that message has been that there's a willingness to listen.
It is a message you may have to be a premier to appreciate. Federal New Democrat Lorne Nystrom was less impressed.
It's really a big, expensive PR show, and nothing concrete happens in terms of specific programs. Any announcement that's made is worked out ahead of time by the officials. With an example of that with Flora McDonald's program, and a program which, by the way, doesn't add any money at all to job creation in this country, just reshuffles it and redirects it to a certain degree. So it's a very expensive thing, costing several $million bucks, and I think it's one reason why people are cynical in politics. Very little is done in a substantive sense.
The common ground between a New Democratic premier and his conservative colleagues is, by definition, a pretty small piece of real estate. And despite all the sweet talk, it didn't get much bigger here. Then again, for Pauley, in the long run, a conservative prime minister may be more valuable as an enemy than an ally. For the Journal, this is Bruce Chicato in Regina.